The parking lot burned under the sun. A shout came down like a hammer. "Get on your knees, you black piece of trash. You think I'd let someone like you swagger around here?" The handcuffs yanked hard. His head slammed onto metal with a sharp clang, and the harsh snarl kept coming. "In this city, your skin color is only good enough to be dragged under my feet." A moment of disgrace for the entire system, as the man being trampled was the mayor about to reset the rules of the game. The summer noon at the end of the Greeley industrial line felt like a giant furnace heat rising from the asphalt, making the air seem to burn. The abandoned parking lot sat wedged between rusted warehouses and old barbed wire fences, the smell of oil and metal dust clinging to every breath. A crow perched on a power pole croaked hoarsely, adding more weight to the already stifling tension. Langston Drew leaned against a gray concrete pillar, his face drenched in sweat, eyes fixed on the distance as if searching for a scrap of peace in this dry wasteland. He wore a dark suit, his tie slightly askew from a long morning meeting, but his posture remained upright, one hand on his knee, the other clutching a stack of important documents tied to the city reform program. He did not know that in a few minutes his entire life and dignity would be dragged across the scorching asphalt by the most absurd form of power. A siren wailed patrol, tires screeched on the road, and a cloud of yellow dust rose to block the view. Officer Brad Conley jumped out of the car, his boots thudding heavily on the asphalt, the familiar sound of someone too used to forcing obedience through strength. His right hand gripped the chain of a snarling canine, eyes narrowing as if lining up a target in his sights. "What's that bastard hiding behind the post?" he muttered through clenched teeth, his voice laced with contempt and suspicion. The heat did not make him sweat. Instead, it seemed to boil the anger roiling inside him. His steps were slow but heavy, as though intent on crushing every foot of ground between him and the black man sitting still ahead. Langston did not move, his gaze locked on the patch of sky before him. In his mind, everything went eerily quiet. He could hear every sweep of wind over the rusty fence, the distant rumble of trucks, and the hostile footfalls of the man closing in on him. He knew what was coming. He had seen this scene too many times on the news and civil rights case files and in the frightened eyes of people he had met in the community. But that knowledge did not stop the chill crawling down his spine when the shout tore the air. "You think someone like you gets to take lunch in this area?" The scream was not a question. It was a verdict. Brad stopped in front of Langston, his shadow falling like a dark cloud under the glaring white sun. "Get up. Hands on your head, black dog." His eyes bulged, his breath reeking of cigarettes and burnt coffee, his hand yanking the chain to send the dog lunging forward, bared teeth snapping just inches from Langston's legs. Langston drew in a long breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm waiting for my car. I have papers. But his words were crushed beneath a hammering roar. "I don't need you to explain. Your skin's enough reason for me to drag you away." Those words slammed into the air, into the pride of a man once elected to protect hundreds of thousands of citizens in this city. Langston did not move, his eyes steady and silent, not from fear, but from knowing that every motion could be labeled a threat. He had heard too many stories of black men shot for reaching into their pockets for a phone. He tried to keep everything as low and still as possible except his gaze, and that only drove Brad Conley into a deeper frenzy. His teeth ground together, veins bulging in his neck, a scream tearing through his clenched jaw so vicious even the dog recoiled a step. "Kill that ape." The shout was part command, part insult, part fury from a man who believed the badge on his chest gave him the right to decide who deserved to be called human. The chain snapped, taut claws scraped across the asphalt with a ripping sound. The dog lunged forward but was pulled back at the last moment. Langston closed his eyes for a single second, not from fear, but from a shame that was not his alone, but shared by everyone ever placed beneath the same knife of prejudice. Heat, harsh breathing, and venomous shouting twisted together into a scene that, if not caught on camera, might have been just another story buried in the dark. But a few meters away, a passerby had already raised a phone. The camera shook in furious hands, capturing every scream, every sound of handcuffs ready to snap shut on the wrists of a man who had committed no crime. A scene Brad believed would satisfy his rage, but within hours would set the entire city on fire. Langston drew in another deep breath, his lips pressed tight, his eyes locked on Brad as if etching every line of his face into memory. He said nothing more, no begging, no reaction, no defense. Only a searing silence lingered in the heavy air, thick with oil fumes and blazing sun, a silence that stood in stark contrast to the cutting screams ready to swell into a storm powerful enough to shake the very system Brad Conley thought he controlled. The late noon sun still hammered the asphalt with a suffocating heat, making the abandoned parking lot even more oppressive. Langston Drew's black SUV sat silently by the curb, dust from the morning's site visits clinging to the vehicle and his jacket. The small office nearby had just closed a rushed emergency meeting on a reform project ending quickly so he could stop by this industrial zone to review pleas for help from local residents. He stepped out, brushed his jacket lightly, adjusted his tie out of habit before leaving, then reached into his bag to tuck his city ID badge into the front pocket, planning to head to City Hall right after this stop. But the hurried footsteps behind him and the shadow stretching long across the asphalt made him freeze. Brad Conley needed no reason other than the arrogant instinct of a man used to imposing his will. He strode forward, hand gripping the chain of the snarling K9, his eyes scanning Langston from head to toe with unmasked suspicion. He did not glance at the bag, did not see the glint of the badge, and only saw the color of his skin and wrote the script in his head. He yanked Langston's collar hard, jerking the tie sideways, his harsh voice slicing through the heat. "A permit, huh? I've seen your kind pretending to be city workers all the time." The tone was accusation and kindling, as if he had lived this moment dozens of times, and each one ended with a conviction before a name was asked. Langston drew a long breath, trying to keep his voice steady, though anger pounded in his chest. He was used to baseless suspicion, the cold stares on the street, but it was not always very case that he managed to stay calm in the face of such blatant insult. "I'm on duty," he said, eyes locked on Brad. Not dodging, not bowing, "I work for the city." His words were like air rushing past deaf ears. Brad sneered, the sound sharp, blending with the dog's threatening bark, his gaze holding long-nursed contempt turned instinct. "Yeah, city worker, crawling under my boot." His words came out to underline his power, to remind that in his world, honor and office held no weight when skin color had already fixed one's place beneath him. Langston had no time to react before Brad's hand clamped on his shoulder, spinning him roughly. His wrist was locked with force so harsh that blood seemed ready to burst beneath the skin, the metal of the cuffs clicking with the menacing echo. He forced his breath steady, feeling his heart hammer against his ribs. 100 questions flashed in his head. Would the people of his city see this? Would anyone believe it when their mayor was dragged away like a petty thief? Yet, even in this moment of being demeaned, he fought to keep his gaze unbroken, to never let the officer see even a flicker of plea. Brad shoved him toward the patrol car, his voice biting each word loud enough to fill the deserted lot. "When I say stand still, you stand still. You think that city badge is a free pass?" The dog barked beside them like a drumbeat to his anger. Langston tried to speak, his voice hoarse from the heat and restraint. "You're overstepping your authority. I haven't done anything wrong." The reply was only a mocking grunt and a harder shove, sending him off balance into the scorching hood. The burning metal pressed to his cheek, the stench of paint and oil filling his nostrils. The blue suit he had kept crisp since morning was now crumpled and stretched under a rough grip, treated like a thin shell to be torn away. Brad leaned close to his ear, breath thick with rage and tobacco. "Here I am, the law, and my law doesn't care where you work, only that you don't have my color. The words cut like a blade straight into his mind, an insult not just to Langston, but to everyone he had sworn to protect. Time slowed in the empty parking lot, leaving only the sound of wind rattling rusted signs, the dog's sharp barking, and Langston's labored, restrained breaths. He could feel Brad's gaze pressing down, intent on crushing every trace of resistance in him, but deep inside, he knew he could not break. He closed his eyes for a second, then opened them toward the empty space ahead, his stare becoming a mirror reflecting the crooked system he had fought against for years. And right now, with his face pressed to scorching metal, he knew he was living a brutal version of the stories he had heard from his people, arrests without cause, moments when the law stood silent before undeniable truth, heat, the smell of oil. Brad's shouts and cruel laughter all fused into a mark that would never fade from his memory. Brad cuffed him, yanking hard enough to make his body dip slightly, then slapped his hand on the car roof as if declaring to the world that power belonged to him. Langston tilted his head, drew a deep breath through clenched teeth, the sting of humiliation threading through every nerve but never breaking out his sound. He knew he could not give this man another excuse, but he knew one thing more: this confrontation would not end in this abandoned parking lot. It would reach far beyond, past the industrial zone, past the sirens of patrol cars, and it would awaken a storm Brad Conley never imagined he would face. The patrol car sped down the empty road, its tires grinding against the blistering asphalt, letting out long, grating screeches. Sunlight pierced through the dirty window, casting harsh streaks onto the back seat where Langston Drew sat, twisted, his wrists locked painfully behind him. Sharp aches spreading down his shoulders, making each breath heavier. The air was thick with the smell of cigarette sweat and the warped sense of power radiating from the man in front. Langston rested his head against the cold glass eyes, half closed as he tried to steady himself, but inside a storm raged. Every rational thought told him to stay silent, yet his heart seethed, knowing that every second passing he was being treated as nameless, powerless, worthless, for nothing but the color of his skin. Brad Conley gripped the steering wheel tight, his eyes fixed hard on the road, occasionally flicking to the rearview mirror as if to remind the man behind him who was in control. He suddenly snapped, his voice heavy with threat. Name, address. The question came, not to be answered, but to dominate, to force the man in the back seat to remember that his fate sat in the hands of a cop drunk on authority. Langston drew in a deep breath, forcing his tone calm. Even as fury surged in his throat, I have the right to remain silent. The words came steady but sharp. A taut wire stretched between pride and humiliation, daring the blade of prejudice pressing against his neck. Brad's derisive laugh scratched the air like metal being torn, slicing through the already suffocating tension. He jerked the wheel, sending the car swaying sideways as if to jolt the man in cuffs, then barked each word with venom rights. With your skin, you think you've got rights. Be glad you didn't get shot for reaching into your pocket. His voice ricocheted through the cramped space, each syllable stomping out the last flicker of hope that justice still existed on this road. Langston bit hard on his lip, every muscle tightening to keep his fury from spilling over. He turned his face toward the window, watching trees and road signs blur past, wondering how many others had sat where he sat, feeling this same helplessness as their truth and dignity were twisted beneath the hands of men sworn to uphold the law. A heavy silence stretched for seconds before shattering as Langston slowly turned his head back, his eyes lit with a resolve even Brad could sense, though he despised it. Langston's voice was calm, but it filled the car, a declaration in the middle of an unjust battlefield. I have the same rights as anyone on this land. A brief stillness followed, as if the words had stirred something in the air before it was crushed beneath the contemptuous laugh that answered. Brad hissed, each word hammered out like a brand meant to scar every inch of the man behind him. On this land, skin color decides how fast the bullet flies. The words dropped onto the back seat like a sledgehammer, not only striking Langston but suffocating the very values he had fought to defend. The pledges of justice, once spoken in council chambers, now dissolved inside the four metal walls of this car. In that moment, Langston felt his blood rush faster, his heart pounding not from fear, but from anger and a quiet resolve. He knew this was no longer a personal story. It was the visible tip of an iceberg that had drowned thousands before him. His mind flashed to his family, to the citizens who had placed their trust in him, to the countless times he had stood on a podium promising that the city would be fair for everyone. Now, in the back of this police car, he was the living proof of the collapse of those promises. He knew that this moment, if seen, if heard, would be the blade slicing through the silence that had lasted far too long. Brad kept driving, unaware that the camera light inside the car had been on since the engine started. Every word he spat, every insult, every cold metallic clash of the cuffs was being recorded clearly. He still believed this was just another meaningless stop, a show of power that would end with a false report and another man walking out of the station with hopeless eyes. What he didn't know was that every bead of sweat rolling down Langston's face, every poisonous word he uttered, was becoming undeniable evidence that would not be buried in a drawer like dozens of other cases, but would ignite into a fire that burned down the false facade he and men like him had built for years. The patrol car sped down the road leading to the station, dust swirling in thick clouds behind it as if dragging along the shame of an entire city. Langston closed his eyes for a second, not to escape, but to carve every insult, every jolt of the car, every wrench of the cuffs into memory, turning them into fuel for the fight ahead. He didn't yet know that within hours those words would echo across social media, becoming a question too big for a nation still weary from its cycle of prejudice and warped power to ignore. And right now, in the cramped space of that car, in the stifling heat and the cold metallic smell, Langston knew he had just witnessed the true face of the system he had sworn to reform, a truth that would never again be buried. The patrol car door swung open with a harsh metallic clang, letting in a gust of dusty air mixed with gasoline fumes and the heavy humid heat of the police station's back lot. Langston Drew was yanked out, his shoes scraping hard against the rough concrete, his head jerking with the force of Brad Conley's pull. A dark stream of blood trickled from his nose, dripping onto the blistering pavement under the late noon sun, each drop a testament to cruelty stripped of any pretense. His tie fell to the ground, coated in dirt, and crushed under the heel of a man who believed he had the right to decide who deserved respect. The gray brick walls of the yard stood tall and cold, enclosing a suffocating atmosphere where every watching eye seemed to guess who would be the next soul dragged through the heavy steel doors of the holding cells. A rookie officer nearby, his face still young under the brim of his cap, hesitated, a flicker of unease in his eyes, as he witnessed a scene that bore no resemblance to any arrest procedure taught at the academy. He stepped forward slightly, his voice dropping, as if afraid his own question might be overheard. "Who'd you bring in?" Brad spat on the ground, his glare laced with open contempt. "Some black guy wandering around looking like a looter." The words left his mouth light as air delivered, as if they were self-evident truth, as if no proof, no reason beyond skin color was ever needed to define a man. The rookie drew in a long breath, swallowing down the protest caught in his throat, staring instead at Brad's hand clamped on Langston as if gripping an object without life or worth. Langston was dragged down a narrow hallway toward the holding area, the pale glow of the fluorescent lights above stretching long shadows across the tiled floor. He was shoved into a small cell, the iron door slamming shut with a cold echoing finality. His wrists remained cuffed, red marks deepening into bruises, the ache spreading down to his fingertips. No phone call was offered, no one asked his name, and no paperwork exchanged hands. All that remained were four damp foul-smelling walls, the creak of an overhead fan, and the hollow weight of being erased by the system. He leaned his head against the wall for a moment, not in surrender, but to stop himself from falling apart. In that instant, he thought of all the people who had once shared their stories with him of being held without cause of vanishing for hours into darkness without a trace. Today, he realized he was one of them. Across the city, City Hall was unusually silent. The mayor's desk still held the stack of files on the pending police reform bill, a signature pen lying across the page as if abandoned in haste. His personal secretary kept glancing at the clock, dialing every office on the contact list, only to be met with tense, unanswered rings. News outlets began pushing updates, headlines flashing. This morning, Mayor Drew did not attend the scheduled city council meeting. Emergency session canceled without explanation. A few journalists exchanged quiet calls, sensing something big was unfolding beyond their reach. No one knew that the city's leader, the man who had once stood on stage pledging to protect the civil rights of every citizen, now sat in a damp holding cell just a few blocks away, nameless, powerless, and voiceless. Brad walked past the row of cells after finishing the brief procedure in the office, coffee cup in hand, his eyes carrying the bitter triumph of a man savoring a meaningless but gratifying victory. He stopped at the small window of Langston's cell, lips curling into a mocking smirk. There was no trace of recognition that the man before him ran the entire city, no sign of remorse. Only the worn malice of someone convinced of his own untouchable power, his words seeping through the door like venom. "Don't expect me to apologize for treating you like a dog." He turned on his heel, footsteps thudding against the tile floor, fading into the metallic echoes of the steel doors and the strained silence of the cell. Langston closed his eyes, his hands clenching into fists behind his back, feeling the hot pulse of blood rushing through his veins. He didn't need an apology, but deep down he knew the insult just hurled was the spark that would ignite the fire to burn down the false veil Brad and men like him had cast over this city. The ceiling fan kept creaking. As it turned, the light dimmed with the creeping shadows of dusk filtering through the bars, yet Langston sat upright. In his steady gaze, the heavy steel cuffs no longer felt like tools meant only to restrain his body. They had become a pre-written sentence handed to every black person judged before being heard, a symbol of rotten power claiming the right to define a human being's worth. And he knew when this door opened, nothing would ever be the same again. In the communications office at City Hall, the afternoon passed in inexplicable chaos. Phones rang without pause, email alerts blinked every second, reporters, journalists, and even ordinary citizens kept asking about Mayor Langston Drew's morning schedule. He was supposed to appear in a meeting with the city council to sign the next phase of the police reform bill, yet the chair remained empty through the morning and well into the afternoon. His private secretary, Alyssa, stood by the window, clutching her phone, her face marked by tension after a string of futile calls. She tried every location on his schedule, from the council chambers to the industrial district he had planned to visit, but received the same repeated answer. He hasn't shown up. When she finally called the police department's internal line to check, a desk officer replied curtly, "Mr. Drew is in an internal security meeting. Urgent matters." The voice was unnatural, as if read from a makeshift script, sending a chill down Alyssa's spine, an unshakable sense that something was terribly wrong, though she couldn't yet name it. Meanwhile, in a dim corner of the police station where fluorescent light cast damp stains into sharp relief on the walls, Langston still sat on a rusted metal chair, his hands cuffed behind his back, his silent gaze fixed on the bars ahead. The heavy footsteps of a guard echoed down the narrow hallway. When the young officer stopped outside the cell door, Langston lifted his head, his voice hoarse yet firm on every word. "Do you have a daughter?" The guard froze for a split second, surprise flashing in his eyes at the unexpected question. "Why would you ask that?" he replied cautiously, as if fearing anyone else might hear. Langston tilted his head, meeting the man's gaze, his tone low but weighted. Because if one day she was dragged in here, treated like I am now, would you stay silent? The words fell into the thick, stifling air of the holding area, heavy as stone, echoing into every corner of the cold hallway. The young officer stood motionless, his hand tightening on the baton at his hip, as if wrestling with himself. He had seen countless arrests before, heard the same tired justifications that everything followed procedure, that skin color was never the issue, that following orders keeps you safe. But in this moment, staring into the eyes of the bound man before him, not just a citizen, but the city's mayor, a raw unease clawed at him. He couldn't find any answer, except the long stretch of silence that followed. Langston leaned his head back against the wall, eyes closing, but his words lingered in the young man's mind, planting the seed of a decision he had never considered. Night fell. The city lights flickered on. Life outside kept moving, but inside the police station the silence hung thicker, choking the air. The young guard stood before his locker, hands trembling slightly as he pulled out his phone. Glancing around to make sure no one was watching, he opened an encrypted messaging app his friends once used for anonymous tips. After a few seconds of hesitation, his fingers typed out the words, "The person being held is the mayor." He paused, knowing this could upend his career and his life if discovered, but Langston's question resurfaced, cutting through every fear. He hit send, exhaling a long, sharp breath, as if stepping across an invisible line, then tucked his phone away and returned to his post, his eyes still unsteady. The message was like a drop of water hitting a still lake, sending ripples quickly spreading beyond the sealed concrete walls of the building. The recipient, a freelance journalist known for covering civil rights issues, read it once and immediately forwarded it to a trusted colleague, adding only one line. "If this is true, this could be the biggest scandal the city has ever seen." The leak passed through several hands, each step layering more suspicion, more outrage, building silently in the shadows of an unofficial media network. The next morning, before the sun could burn off the thick mist clinging to the high-rises, social media erupted. A video clip less than a minute long appeared simultaneously across multiple platforms, opening with a shout that tore through the screen, "Kill that ape." The sound, vicious and raw, left first-time listeners stunned, their shock quickly hardening into fury. The camera shook violently, the frame unsteady but clear enough to show a black man being yanked hard onto blistering asphalt, his proud gaze refusing to drop even as blood streamed from his nose. None of the millions watching that morning knew yet that the victim was Mayor Langston Drew, but just hearing the shout, seeing the cuffs and the brute force pinning him down, they understood this was no lawful arrest but an act of humiliation legitimized only by the color of a uniform. And in that instant, the heavy silence of the previous night began to crack, signaling a furious storm about to sweep through the city, tearing into the open a rotten power that had lingered far too long. In a rundown apartment in the southern part of the city, dim light from a flickering neon fixture on the ceiling spilled onto the worn tile floor. Peeling paint clung to the walls, and dusty curtains blocked the outside world from the cramped space. Yet the air inside was thick with a tension no one could have predicted. A young student, hair messy and wearing a plain t-shirt, sat in the corner, clutching his phone. He had no idea that the next few moments would change his life, maybe even alter the fate of the city he called home. He had simply opened a social media app, trying to unwind after a long, exhausting day, but what appeared on the screen made him freeze, fingers tightening around the device, heart pounding out of rhythm. The phone vibrated violently in his hand, trembling as a man's furious voice ripped through the video, sharp and ice cold. "Kill that ape?" The words were like a blade slicing the air, raw and cutting. In an instant, the dim light in the tiny room seemed to fade further, everything around him disappearing until there was nothing but that sound and the fragmented images flashing before his eyes. It didn't take long to realize this wasn't just another video. It was a raw, brutal moment playing out live, the suffocating tension of a life pushed to the brink, captured in real time. On the screen, Langston Drew's face came into sharp focus. His hair was disheveled, and blood streamed from his nose, staining the fabric of his worn suit jacket. But it wasn't the visible pain that unsettled viewers. It was the strange, unshaken calm in his eyes. Even with his hands cuffed even under rough, relentless force, Langston held the bearing of a man who refused to bend. There was no fear in his gaze, only determination, the steady resolve of someone who knew the price of fighting for truth. The contrast was stark next to police officer Brad Conley, standing nearby, eyes bloodshot with rage, clutching a dog chain as if dealing with something less than human. And it was this quiet, defiant strength in Langston's demeanor that sent the 47-second video surging across the internet like wildfire. Within minutes, the video had captured the attention of millions. The hashtag #YouJustArrested. The mayor appeared on every social media platform from Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to TikTok. The scene was no longer just a personal incident. It instantly became a symbol of injustice, abuse of power, and racial prejudice pushed to the extreme. People began sharing the video, fiercely debating what had happened, and almost no one could believe that a sitting mayor could be treated this way. Comment after comment poured in, relentless. Why treat the city's leader like this if a mayor can be treated this way? What chance does an ordinary person have? Where is justice? Why is no one speaking up? The video's explosion of attention quickly grew beyond the city, spreading nationwide. Major news outlets began reporting on it, publishing endless analyses of the incident, dissecting every second of the clip. Social experts, legal scholars, and human rights organizations publicly condemned the police's actions and demanded a formal investigation. Some even called for a complete overhaul of the policing system, pointing out that this was far from the first case of abuse of power and that every individual responsible needed to be held accountable. But the outrage hit even harder when ordinary people, many of whom had never cared about politics or racial issues, felt something deep inside them stir. Stories of police misconduct were no longer distant tales. They had become everyone's problem. Social media became the place where people found connection, found their own voice in a world where justice was often buried in darkness. Articles and videos spread like wildfire, and no one could have predicted that this arrest, which seemed at first like just one isolated incident, would create such a massive media storm. Mayor Langston Drew, once a man on the podium promising to fight for justice for all, had now become a symbol of injustice itself. Yet, in the eyes of many, he was not just a victim of wrongdoing. He was a man who stood his ground, who faced those in power without bowing his head. His calm defiance in that moment reached millions of hearts, making them realize that in a fair society, no one has the right to demean another person because of their skin color or social standing. Though the video continued to spread and shock, it also sparked a powerful wave of reaction from the city's own residents. They refused to let such wrongdoing go unanswered, and Langston, even as he faced humiliation and injustice in that moment, knew deep down that this would not end here. This would become the driving force to change the very system he had spent years fighting to reform. The afternoon in the cafe was unremarkable, save for the low hum of the coffee machine and the warm yellow light reflecting off the cold cement walls. Ava Nguyen sat in her usual corner laptop, open screen glowing with unread emails. She had just walked in after a long meeting with her editor about an ongoing investigation, but her mind was unsettled. The arrest of Mayor Langston Drew lingered in her thoughts, not because of what had happened, but because of the questions still left unanswered. Something felt wrong, something larger than the story the media was painting. Then, as she scrolled through her inbox, this, her eyes stopped on an anonymous email from an unnamed sender. The message had no subject line, only a single shared link in its body. She didn't hesitate before clicking it open. The documents that appeared on her screen made her freeze for a moment. A chill ran down her spine as she realized these were internal police reports. She scrolled down, eyes locked on every line until a familiar name surfaced: Brad Conley. Each report told a story of violence, of times when he had stepped far beyond the boundaries of the law. Black subject showed non-compliance through eye contact. One report read, Ava felt a mental blow land hard. Allegations, long buried, long dismissed as routine, now stared back at her in stark detail. Page after page, the pattern was clear, each incident stoking her anger further. 6 different complaints, all dropped, all ignored, and every single one was tied to the same man, Brad Conley. Ava straightened in her seat, her mind spinning with the brutal truth she had just uncovered. This was bigger than anyone had dared to say out loud. Mayor Langston Drew was only one victim in a rotten system built to bury the truth. She exhaled sharply, fingers poised over the keyboard. The words could not be held back any longer. The story had to be told, not only to expose what happened to Langston, but to reveal the deeper sickness of unchecked power of men like Brad Conley, who had been shielded for far too long. She began writing her first piece with no hesitation this time. How many others did the man who mistakenly arrested the mayor also wrongly arrest? The question echoed in her mind, demanding to be asked. Every line she typed struck at the cover-up that had lasted for years. She didn't just want to call out Brad Conley's actions, she wanted to force the public to face the bigger truth about a policing system that had protected men like him again and again. She remembered past meetings, the times reporters stayed silent, the stories about police abuse that were pushed aside. She couldn't stay silent anymore. When the article was finished, Ava couldn't stop rereading every sentence. She checked every source, made sure every detail was accurate, that nothing was missing, that no part of the accusation could be challenged. She knew this piece wouldn't be easy to publish. It would spark outrage, raise questions about transparency in the system. But Ava understood this was the moment to speak the truth. She sent the article to her editor along with a short message. This is the story of what happened, what they've been hiding. The article went live just a few hours later. The public reaction was immediate. Thousands of people began sharing it at once. Comments flooded social media platforms from Twitter to Facebook. Human rights organizations, civil rights groups all jumped in. The biggest question echoed everywhere. If the mayor was treated like this, what happens to everyone else? The comments were full of anger, but also full of hope, insisting that without intervention, without speaking out, abusers of power would keep running the game. People started revisiting old cases they had ignored, searching for evidence that had been buried. Ava's article didn't just grab attention in the city. It spread to major newspapers, national news channels. The national broadcaster began covering the case, demanding an urgent investigation into Brad Conley and everyone who had helped bury his wrongdoing. Ava's report struck a nerve, revealing a truth many citizens had never fully grasped: a system where the public wasn't being protected but oppressed by those meant to safeguard them. And in this story, Langston Drew was not just a mayor wrongly arrested, but a man who had stood up, who had faced a system rotten with injustice. As the article continued to spread, Ava sensed a profound shift. The outrage, the shame over what had happened, and finally the rising hope for change were sweeping through the community. The long silence had been broken, and now was the time to set things right. But Ava knew this fight wouldn't end with her first article. It was only the beginning. The light from a black mother's phone screen lit up her modest apartment in the night, casting faint reflections on her face under the dim wall lamp. She sat in the corner, holding her phone tightly, eyes fixed on the screen where the video of Langston being dragged away under the oppression of Officer Brad Conley was spreading everywhere. But what made her stop wasn't the violent act itself. It was Langston's face, still calm, his eyes never lowered, despite the constant shoves from the officer. That image felt like a statement, a voice in the silence, and she knew she couldn't stay on the sidelines. With a quick motion, she captured the moment, her finger swiping to send it to a friend. But when she looked at the photo she had just saved, a wave of awe hit her. This wasn't just an ordinary scene, it was a symbol, a testament to the resilience and unbroken strength of a black man under oppression, not by sheer force, but by the unjust treatment he had to endure every day. She didn't hesitate for long. She quickly posted the photo on social media with a short but powerful caption, "We are not beaten for resisting, we are beaten for existing." That caption was not only a defiance against Brad Conley's actions, but also a larger message, a scream for all those pushed into the shadows. Spread like wildfire through the night. Within minutes, the photo had thousands of shares, each person adding their own story, each person adding a call for justice. Across different neighborhoods in the city, the banner, #Stand Tall, began to appear. At first, they were just simple posters with that phrase, then banners, then hand-painted slogans pasted everywhere from houses to public walls. The images of Langston, his face bloodied, but his head unbowed, his hands cuffed, but his eyes unwavering, became a symbol of relentless struggle. People who had never met him started joining in, sharing their own stories of oppression, experiences they had endured but never spoken about. A group of college students, veterans of previous social movements, decided to organize a march. Leading it was a young woman named Jasmine who couldn't stay quiet after seeing the photo. She told the group, "We can't let this stop at just a photo. Langston isn't just a mayor. He stands for everyone who's been treated unjustly because of their skin color." The march was set up immediately. Posters of the moment Langston was dragged away, still calm, still unbowed, were printed on every sign carried alongside the demand for a full investigation into police actions, especially those of officers like Brad Conley. The march quickly drew attention with handheld posters, flags, and student banners held high as they moved through the city's main streets. The participants, regardless of age or race, walked together toward police headquarters, calling for transparency and justice. Police cannot abuse their power. "We need justice," they shouted, and in those chants was a powerful longing, an unquenchable urge that made anyone standing on the sidelines question fairness in this society. The march was not just a major event in this city. It became part of a powerful movement spreading nationwide. Major outlets like CNN, BBC, and the New York Times swiftly reported on the incident, calling it the biggest police scandal in the past decade. Analysts, human rights organizations, and ordinary citizens all demanded a full investigation. Interviews about Langston, about what had happened, and about the disparity in how police treat black people went beyond this city, reaching other states. Major newspapers continued to report on it, turning the issue into a national discussion. Meanwhile, Langston remained in custody. But now his story had reached beyond the prison walls, spread into every street corner, every home, every school. His image, the resilient man who did not bow his head even in the moment he was stripped of every right, had become a flame igniting hope for many. And that the very spread of his unwavering strength made it impossible for people to stay silent in the face of injustice. The photo was not just proof of one officer's wrongdoing. It was an awakening for a system that had forgotten its duty. And as the photo, the posters, and the hashtag #Stand Tall spread everywhere, a great wave began, a movement to reclaim justice had been sparked. People could no longer turn away from the truth, and they knew this fight was not just Langston's. It was for everyone who had been pushed outside the law simply because of their skin color. The emergency city council meeting was held urgently amid the growing wave of public outrage. The large city hall chamber, usually reserved for serious discussions on urban development projects, felt unusually tense today. The long tables were neatly arranged, but the air was thick with confusion and fear. Under the harsh lights, council members sat in haste, unable to remain indifferent to the event that had shaken the entire city. Unanswered questions, hidden truths, and the public's resistance had pushed everything to its breaking point. Langston Drew entered stripped of the authority once associated with the title of mayor, without his usual tailored suit or his habit of standing tall and formal. Today he came in plain clothes, just a simple shirt and trousers, no tie, no air of sternness or power. He was a citizen, only a citizen, yet he had become the voice for the voiceless, for those forgotten by the very system they once trusted to protect their rights. Langston stepped up to the podium, his eyes no longer strained or tired, but filled with resolve. He stood there in the heavy silence of the chamber, where officials had no words to offer, every gaze fixed on him. That tension was not enough to make him falter. Langston looked directly at the council members, unwavering, unafraid. He spoke each word clearly, powerfully. "I don't need an apology from you. I need you to stop tormenting the nameless." His words rang out sharp as lightning, striking the heart of everyone present. There was no hesitation, no pity, only blunt, uncompromising truth. He wasn't waiting for agreement, nor hoping for sympathy from those listening. Langston had not come here to receive compassion, but to force everyone in that room to face the truth they had long chosen to ignore. Langston's eyes moved from one council member to another, scanning faces accustomed to power faces he once thought would stand with him in the fight for justice. But today everything was different. His words were a challenge thrown at all those who had grown comfortable in their seats of authority, those who had forgotten that justice was not reserved for the powerful, but for every citizen. And now, in their eyes, he was no longer a mayor. He was only a man demanding fairness for himself and for countless nameless others who had endured injustice for far too many years. The entire chamber fell silent. Langston's words did not just force the council members to think. They shook the very foundation of a system that had stood for too long without realizing it was decaying under the weight of the justice it claimed to uphold. Langston sought no leniency, expected no forgiveness. He simply wanted this system, from city government to every single police officer, to stop treating people like him, like other ordinary citizens, as if they were unworthy of respect. When Langston finished speaking, the air in the council chamber seemed heavier, quieter. No one said a word, no one offered a rebuttal, but in their eyes awareness seemed to have been awakened. Langston Drew was no longer just a man wrongfully arrested. He had become a representative for unheard voices, for those forced to live in fear that one day they too would become victims of abuse of power simply because they lacked the means to fight back. And Langston, through his actions alone, had forced everyone in that room to face what they had long chosen to ignore. After Langston's firm words, the atmosphere in the chamber grew stiflingly tense. There were no claps or words of praise yet. In that thick silence, something was changing. The city council sat frozen, no one daring to speak, though their minds were a battlefield of clashing thoughts. No one could deny that Langston was right, that this system had for too long been built on layers of deceit, protecting abusers of power and disregarding nameless citizens. But even so, how could they begin to repair it? How could they face themselves knowing that everything they had done had built a system now collapsing under the weight of its own failings? Those questions did not stay unspoken for long. They showed in the way council members glanced at one another and the secretive looks they exchanged in their hesitant movements as they prepared to vote. Gradually, a consensus formed. A decision was made, not because they wanted to, but because they knew there was no other choice. The city council officially voted to establish a temporary police oversight committee, an independent body tasked with monitoring and investigating all abuses of power, especially those that had been covered up or ignored for years. When the announcement was made, the mood in the chamber remained unchanged. The strained faces of the council members betrayed no joy or satisfaction, only reluctant acceptance. They knew they could no longer shield the system they had built, that this decision was only the first step in a long struggle they now had to take part in, whether they wished to or not. As night fell, news of the vote and the formation of the Oversight Committee spread quickly, but the people of the city did not sit idly by. Their anger still burned like a fire that would not die. A step had been taken, yet they knew what had happened could not simply be erased with a meeting and a decision. They needed action. They needed to prove that those in power would not escape public scrutiny, would not continue stripping away the rights of the voiceless. And as darkness settled, when the streets grew quiet, suddenly a great wave began to rise. From neighborhoods, from small cafes, from schools, citizens poured into the streets. These were not loud riots, but a calm, determined wave. Hands raised banners, simple yet powerful, carrying one clear message: no one is above the law, not even the police. These chants were not just protests. They were a declaration that justice did not belong to a select few. It belonged to everyone. And in the night, those voices echoed through the streets, uniting hearts, uniting people who had once been silent but now stood together. It was a new beginning, not only for Langston, but for the entire city. There was no regret, no easy forgiveness. Everything had been exposed, and from now on, rebuilding trust would be the hardest fight for all who had once stayed silent and on the sidelines. But today, they were silent no more, and that voice would not be silenced again. The public hearing was held in a large meeting room at City Hall, the atmosphere heavy and tense, with countless camera lights flashing into every corner of the space. Live cameras were set up everywhere, recording every movement, every word, every furrowed brow, every breath of those involved. Everyone knew that what would unfold in this room was not just a regular trial, but a confrontation with the truth that everyone in the city had to hear and witness. Police officer Brad Conley, accused of abusing his power in the arrest of Mayor Langston Drew, was no longer the confident man with a badge on his chest, but a person forced to confront his own actions. Standing before the cameras, his face no longer showed confidence, but fear and hesitation, as the whole world watched every word he spoke. When the video of the arrest was shown on the screen, the atmosphere in the room suddenly grew heavy. The scene was undeniable. Brad Conley shouted in anger, his voice hissing through every word. "This black guy doesn't need evidence to be cuffed." The shout was not just words, but a confirmation of a system that had long judged people by the color of their skin, a perspective that had existed too long in this society. That shout was like an unhealed wound revealing hatred and contempt toward those deemed different. The room fell silent, and everyone could feel the tension in the air as Brad's words echoed in their hearts like a painful truth. After the video ended, the silence in the room remained, all eyes fixed on Brad. Langston Drew's defense attorney, the representative of justice in this hearing, stood up with a serious expression. His eyes locked onto Brad's, devoid of anger, just cold, determined resolve. "So his skin color, the reason for arresting someone?" he asked, his voice calm but full of challenge. The question hit Brad like a knife choking him for a moment. He broke into a sweat, biting his lip, then wiped his forehead. No excuses, no reasonable answer. The room remained silent, with only Brad's heavy breathing filling the space. That silence dragged on, and it felt as though each passing second was weightier than the last. He couldn't respond, couldn't justify anything. Every word, every action he had taken before now haunted him. The harsh lights shone directly on his face as if they were trying to expose every corner of his soul, one that had accumulated so much hatred and prejudice. Brad could no longer maintain his composure. He tried to stiffen himself, but deep inside, he knew that everything was slipping out of his control. Throughout his life, he had been accustomed to easily wielding power over the powerless, but today everything had changed. Langston Drew was not the first to face his abuse of power, but he was the first to make him face himself. The lawyer's question was not just a legal inquiry, but a challenge, a reminder of the justice that he and others like him had long forgotten. Brad stood there, unsure how to respond. Every passing second felt like an insurmountable challenge. He looked down, unable to meet the eyes of those around him. Every answer felt meaningless because he knew deep down that what had happened was inexcusable. The entire room remained silent. Only the rapid beating of hearts in the chests of those present could be heard. The citizens, activists, and journalists witnessing this hearing understood that it wasn't Brad's answer that mattered, but what he had caused. The entire city had been shaken, and today the truth was finally coming to light. Langston Drew was not just a victim. He was a man who dared to stand up, a man challenging a system long corrupted by power and discrimination. In the end, Brad said nothing. He simply stood there, receiving the gaze of everyone present, realizing that there was no escaping the shadow he had cast upon himself. The room fell back into silence, but the anger within everyone remained undiminished. The question still echoed in their minds, a question about power, fairness, and a system that needed to change. And in those moments they knew that nothing would ever be the same again. A middle-aged man stood up from the back row, his voice hoarse but clear in every word, causing everyone in the room to turn and listen. He recounted how a few years ago he had witnessed Brad Conley stop a black student just for running home after school. Brad had dragged the boy to the ground, shouting as if arresting a dangerous criminal, and when asked why, he had simply replied, "That look wasn't cooperative." The witness paused, staring directly at Brad, and continued with barely contained anger. "That day, I thought I would hear an apology, but no, just the silence of a system that protected him." The short story landed like a slap to those trying to avoid the truth, bringing everyone back to the fact that Langston's case wasn't the first mistake, but the visible part of an iceberg of injustice that had existed for far too long. The atmosphere in the room suddenly shifted like a spark igniting a barrel of oil. Many of the onlookers could no longer control their emotion. Whispers, discussions, and frustrated sighs filled the air. A young woman clenched the newspaper in her hands, her eyes red as she remembered her own brother being humiliated by police on the street. A human rights activist stood up sharply, her voice resolute. "This is no longer about one individual. This is a disease that runs deep, and he's its living proof." Her words sparked a wave of opposition that spread through the room. The tense silence now replaced with voices rising in unison, as if everyone had been waiting for this moment to release what had been suppressed for too long. The chant began from one corner of the room, a simple but heavy statement: "No more room for abusers of power." The chant, like a command from the heart, was immediately taken up by many, reverberating off the walls, drowning out the sound of the microphone crackling due to the overwhelming volume. Journalists raised their cameras higher, capturing this historic moment where those who were once mere spectators now became the loud voices of protest. The lawmakers, so accustomed to an atmosphere of formality, could no longer maintain their composure, lowering their heads, their eyes filled with a mix of shame and fear. Brad Conley sat there, his face rigid, hands gripping the glass of water in front of him as if searching for something to hold on to. He didn't dare look at the crowd, no longer willing to respond to the accusations, knowing there was no escape this time. No one in that room believed his excuses about procedural protocol or misunderstandings anymore. The buried stories were rising, memories of injustice were spreading, and all of them pointed toward the man who had once been shielded by the system. The chant, "No more room for abusers of power," continued to swell like a wave, strong and unrelenting, turning the hearing from an interrogation into a public sentencing of all the oppressive actions that had been ignored in the past. Among the chanting, Langston sat silently, his eyes glowing with resolve. He knew that this was just the beginning of a long journey to tear down the walls that had bound millions like him, and today the voices of the crowd had started to rewrite the rules of justice for the city. The Human Rights Law Office was located on the third floor of an old building, its windows looking out onto the busy street, but inside it was so quiet that every page turned could be clearly heard. Tall shelves were stacked with thick files, yellowed papers from years past, and countless lawsuits that had either been forgotten or unjustly dismissed. On the long table in the center of the room, 6 new case files were placed. Not Langston Drew's case, but those of others who had faced the same kind of violence, with the same police officer, Brad Conley, appearing in their lives as a figure of fear. 6 victims entered the room one by one, no longer carrying the disappointment or hesitation of years past. This time they had microphones ready, cameras rolling, and a team of lawyers standing behind them. The media and public opinion stood by their side, an unprecedented shift that gave them the courage to confront their old fears. A middle-aged man, his hands rough from years of working as a builder, still stained with paint and cement, placed his file on the table and began speaking. He looked around the room, his gaze briefly resting on the photo of Langston on the cover of a nearby newspaper. His voice was slow, choked with emotion, but clear. Back then, I stayed silent because I was just a construction worker. I thought no one would listen. I was afraid of retaliation, afraid my family would get into trouble if I went against the police. I signed the papers to withdraw my lawsuit just to make it all go away. He paused for a moment, his breath shaking as though releasing a heavy past, then continued. But today I speak up because Mr. Drew didn't stay silent. He stood up when they tried to make him a criminal. He made the world look at this truth. I can't stay silent anymore. I owe him and myself a voice. His words spread like a signal, drawing out the long sighs of the others. A young woman, once a student, when she was stopped by Brad on her way to the dorm, took out her file. She trembled, but was determined. He kept me in the car for 2 hours just because I looked down when asked. They wrote in the report that I didn't cooperate with my eyes. I used to believe I had no choice but to let it go. But today I understand that silence only protected him. Another young man joined in sharing that he was beaten unconscious during an unlawful search and his case was dismissed within a week under the excuse of a misunderstanding. The lead lawyer listened carefully to each account, taking notes, then turned to his colleagues and nodded in agreement. They knew that this time the victims were not alone. Each story presented was backed by evidence, protected by the media, and strongly supported by the public. Cameras followed every word of the accusations, capturing the raw emotions, the long-suppressed pain now bursting into words. Outside the hallway, reporters crowded to cover the story, knowing that what was happening today would mark a turning point, reopening not only these 6 old cases, but a host of others that had been buried. The afternoon light filtered through the window, casting its glow on the stack of files piled on the desk, a reminder that justice, once blocked, had now found its way back. The 6 victims sat together, no longer isolated individuals, but a united collective, supporting each other with truth and courage that had only just been awakened. They didn't promise an easy victory, but at least this time their voices wouldn't be buried, for one person had stood before them and paid the price to open up this opportunity. The forgotten lawsuits were now placed in their rightful place, ready to serve as evidence, the first bricks in rebuilding trust in the justice system that had been left to fall into the mud too long. As the 6 victims finished their testimonies and signed the legal documents, the human rights lawyers immediately began compiling all the evidence, including the previously ignored files, new testimonies, videos from citizens, and data related to past violent arrests. Within just a few hours, a report more than 300 pages long was drafted, detailing years of events that clearly demonstrated the existence of a systematic abuse of power protected by higher-ranking officials. The next day, the city court received a class action lawsuit with Brad Conley's name at the top of the list of defendants, along with several of his superiors accused of covering up and destroying evidence from the past. The lawsuit was filed in front of a crowd of reporters and citizens, leaving no escape for those who once thought they were above the law. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere felt like a storm was brewing as the shouts of the people merged with the continuous clicking of cameras, making this moment an event that could not be ignored. News of the lawsuit spread rapidly across all media outlets, from local newspapers to the largest national agencies, with headlines appearing at a rapid pace, calling it the historic lawsuit on racial violence within the police force. TV channels continuously aired special reports interviewing legal experts, social activists, and even citizens who had been victims but never had the chance to speak up. Social media was flooded with posts analyzing the case, sharing evidence, victims' testimonies, and images from the previous hearing. Public opinion was heated with millions following every development, understanding that this was not just a lawsuit targeting one violent police officer, but a direct challenge to a system that had long tolerated discrimination and abuse of power across generations. The pressure from the public led federal investigative agencies to step in, promising to monitor the trial closely to ensure no political interference or cover-ups would occur again. Outside the courthouse, thousands gathered to show their support, holding up signs reading "Justice for All" and "No More Shelter for Abusers of Power," alongside calls for comprehensive police reform. Journalists captured images of families who had lost loved ones to police violence, holding hands and shedding tears as the class action lawsuit was finally accepted. Many referred to this as an unprecedented milestone in the city's history. On the evening talk shows that same day, legal experts affirmed that if this lawsuit went through to completion, it would set an important precedent, establishing clear limits on police power and forcing leadership to be held accountable to the public. The city, once silent in the face of similar cases, had now become the center of a movement demanding transparency and fairness like never before, making every eye in the country focus here, waiting to see if justice would truly be served this time. Inside the Central Police Headquarters, a large meeting room with sealed-off curtains drawn tightly to prevent the media and public outside from seeing in. The atmosphere was thick with tension and unease. Every tap of a pen on the table or heavy breath was clearly audible. Senior and mid-level officers were urgently summoned to discuss the recently accepted class action lawsuit, which the public had called a shockwave that rocked the entire law enforcement system in the city. Many familiar faces, once calm during meetings, now appeared pale and worried, realizing there was no longer anywhere to hide from responsibility. Before the meeting could properly begin, a young officer, who had been silent up until then, suddenly stood up, slamming his hand down on the table. His voice rang out clear and firm. "We can't continue to protect the abusers of power." His words struck like lightning in the dense air of deceit, leaving many looking at each other in confusion while others quietly nodded in agreement but lacked the courage to speak. The young officer continued, his eyes scanning the rows of leadership. "We've buried the truth for too long, and now it's not just an individual being sued, but this entire department has become a symbol of injustice. If we stay silent now, we will be complicit." The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically as fear and shame spread, causing many to lower their heads. The police chief sat at the head of the table, his face showing clear signs of fatigue and tension. He was accustomed to controlling meetings like this, but today he was the target of countless questioning glances. A veteran officer from the opposite side of the table tapped his hand on the surface, his voice low but filled with pressure. "How many complaints have disappeared under your watch? How much evidence was either erased or never escalated to higher authorities?" The question rang out like an accusation, pointing directly at the man once seen as the embodiment of discipline within the police force. A series of follow-up questions followed, with officers asking about cases they had suspected but never dared to mention, internal suspensions that were never made public, and requests for help that were rejected for lack of evidence, even though everyone knew the truth was far more complicated. The police chief struggled to remain calm, his fist tightening, his voice quivering slightly as he responded that all decisions had followed procedure, but he was immediately countered by the new evidence made public by the media, showing that many files had disappeared under his tenure in a systematic manner. No one in the room was willing to hear empty answers anymore, for now every word could be exposed to the public if the truth was twisted any further. The meeting quickly descended into chaos as several younger officers demanded an immediate review of all procedures for handling complaints, while also also suspending individuals involved in the cover-ups of past cases. Some senior officers remained silent, fearing for their positions, while another group openly supported this proposal, calling for an end to the herd mentality that had turned the law enforcement agency into a shield for the wrongdoers. For the first time in many years, the police chief, once untouchable in his seat of power, had to face the reality that his authority was no longer inviolable. Outside the meeting room, the voices of the people demanding reform and justice echoed through every crack in the door, a reminder that no false peace could exist anymore. Although the closed-door meeting wasn't being broadcasted live, every question, every struggle, and the fear in the room marked a turning point as the internal police force was forced to confront the truth that they had created a system that fostered violence and prejudice, and that the storm of justice sweeping in would leave no one still clinging to the shadows of old power. After nearly 3 hours of intense debate, with questions coming fast and new evidence from old files being relentlessly uncovered, the atmosphere in the meeting room was thick with anger and tension. The police chief, accustomed to controlling meetings, where he always made the final call, sat silently, surrounded by a barrage of accusations. Young colleagues, once too fearful to speak, now stood up demanding action, no longer allowing abuse of power to persist within their ranks. Each suggestion was read aloud, more nods of agreement followed, and finally they all came to one decision that no one could avoid. Brad Conley, who had become the symbol of the corruption of the law in the public eye, must be completely removed from the force. The police chief sat silently before the disciplinary document, his pen trembling in his hand, his eyes flickering with confusion and bitterness as he signed the order to permanently remove Brad's badge, a colleague once protected at all costs, now stripped of the only power he had relied on to impose fear on others. When the final stroke of the pen was made, the room fell silent with no cheers or regrets, only a heavy sense that a long-closed door had been shut on a world filled with darkness and shameful secrets. Outside the police headquarters, hundreds of citizens remained, having waited since early morning, holding up signs demanding justice in the fading afternoon sunlight. They didn't know exactly what was happening inside, but they understood that today's meeting would be decisive for the city's future. When a human rights lawyer stepped out holding the announcement, only a few brief words were broadcast through the loudspeakers. The decision to permanently revoke Brad Conley's badge had been signed, and the crowd erupted. Cheers, tears, and tight embraces spread across the square, many people lifting their heads to the night sky as if shedding a weight they had carried on their chests for years. A strong, proud voice shouted out, "This is the law." The chant was taken up by hundreds, reverberating through the streets, bouncing off the walls of the building that had long protected the wrongdoers, now forced to bow before the strength of justice. The feeling of victory was not simply joy, but the affirmation that the people's voices had broken through the thick wall of silence and cover-ups. Phones were raised to capture this moment, images of the crowd chanting together, faces glowing with hope, flooding social media just minutes later, turning the internal disciplinary decision into a historic milestone. Many understood that this was not the end of the struggle, that there were still many wounds unhealed and many cases yet to be revealed. But at least today, they witnessed the first brick being laid to rebuild trust in justice. On the steps of the headquarters, children sat on their parents' shoulders, shouting the slogans, marking a moment when the whole city saw real change, where power was no longer inviolable and where the law had finally stood on the right side. The morning of the trial dawned under a gloomy sky with thick clouds covering the city courthouse, as if nature itself understood that today would be a day remembered for years to come in this place's history. Hundreds of citizens had been lined lining up early in front of the gates, their eyes resolute and filled with hope, holding up signs demanding justice. Inside the courtroom was packed from the spectator seats to the press area, all silent as the judge entered. The atmosphere was heavy yet full of the strength of solidarity with millions of others watching the trial through live broadcasts and social media platforms where every moment was being shared across the country, ensuring no one could turn a blind eye to the truth that was being revealed. The prosecutor stepped forward, his stern face reflecting a determination to press charges not just against one individual but against a dark part of the system that had protected him for so long. He didn't start with long-winded words. Instead, the lights in the courtroom shifted toward a large screen and a series of video evidence was shown. 5 clips, each one a heartbreaking story, a testament to how Brad Conley had used his badge as a license to impose fear and violence on innocent black people. The first clip showed his harsh shout as he forced a teenager to the ground simply because the boy was walking faster than he deemed normal. The second showed a woman being shoved against a wall, her cries blending with the sound of boots stomping on the cold floor. The third depicted Brad tearing up a complaint report in front of a witness, throwing it in the trayesse and walking away as if no one had the right to question him. The final 2 clips were even more chilling, showing handcuffed hands, bowed heads in fear, pleading eyes unanswered, and Brad's familiar harsh voice shouting with no humanity. The entire room fell silent, the sound of the video echoing like an accusation from the souls he had trampled on their right to live. When the screen turned off, the atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy enough to be cut with a knife. The prosecutor turned around, his voice loud and clear. This is not a singular mistake. This is a pattern of abuse of power, protected by the system, nurtured by prejudice and the silence of those who should have been protecting the citizens. He pointed to Brad, who sat with his head down, then continued. He is not a law enforcer. He is a purveyor of fear and deadly prejudice under the guise of justice. These words brought tears to many spectators, for they heard not just Langston Drew's story, but the story of countless families who had suffered similarly but were never heard. The press captured every word, every expression, sending it out to millions of viewers, making the entire city hold its breath, waiting for the final verdict. The judge, an elderly man whose eyes had witnessed countless trials but had never seen a string of crimes so blatantly repeated, stood after a moment of contemplation. He tapped his gavel lightly on the desk, his voice dropping but becoming strong as though issuing a warning to all. This is not a personal mistake. This is the common denominator of deadly prejudice that has taken root in a segment of law enforcement for too long. He looked around the courtroom, his gaze pausing on the row of police officers present, his eyes stern as if forcing them to absorb every word. Today, we are not just trying one person. We are trying a behavior that has destroyed public trust in the law. And the message this court is sending is clear. There will be no refuge for those who use power to oppress and humiliate others. His ruling rang out loudly, accompanied by 3 firm bangs of the gavel, like a sentence not only for Brad Conley but for an entire system that had sheltered people like him. The courtroom was filled with muffled sobs, some applause mixed with sighs of relief, and outside the courthouse, thousands in the crowd cried in hope that justice had truly returned to this city after so many years buried under the dust of fear and lies. When the judge finished declaring the existence of deadly prejudice within the police force, he turned to the final part of the verdict, his voice echoing throughout the room, each word heavy as a stone falling on the cold floor. Brad Conley is guilty of abuse of power in the line of duty and a severe violation of civil rights. All the evidence presented in this court is irrefutable. The defendant's actions have caused profound harm not only to the direct victims but to this entire community, shaking the foundation of trust in the law. The defendant will be held accountable with a long prison sentence, commensurate with a series of wrongful acts that spanned many years and left irreparable consequences. And the gavel struck 3 times, closing the verdict, but its echo reverberated in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it, a reminder that power misused will have no refuge when justice shines through to the end. Brad sat with his head bowed, his hands trembling, his face no longer holding any defiance, knowing that the day he walked out of prison would be the day the city would have completely forgotten the fake power he once relied on to oppress others. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was filled with emotion and relief. The crowd, which had gathered early in the morning, stood still for a few seconds when the verdict announcement was made before erupting in applause, cheers, and cries of joy like a flood breaking through the dam of darkness that had engulfed the city for years. On the marble steps leading up to the courthouse, a young mother held her small daughter tightly in her arms, tears streaming down her face as she spoke in a trembling but resolute voice. Today, justice does not choose skin color. Her words were not just her own, but those of a community that had been hurt, who had seen their right to live safely and with respect taken away by prejudice and violence. The child in her arms looked around with clear eyes, not fully understanding what was happening, but growing up in a city that had been awakened where voices demanding justice would no longer be silenced as before. The media captured the moment, the image of the mother and child becoming a symbol of the change that many generations had longed for. News outlets broadcast this scene across the nation, with millions of people watching, many families who had suffered from police violence, holding each other and crying in front of their screens, feeling that justice had finally been served. The chants of justice does not choose skin color spread through the streets, echoing like a vow that from now on the law must be placed above all prejudice and that human rights cannot be measured by skin color or social status. The footsteps leaving the courthouse that day were lighter yet more resolute, because everyone understood that this was just the beginning, that the struggle to build a truly fair system was still long, but at least one door had opened, and the light of truth had flooded in, dispelling the darkness of years of neglect and complicity in injustice. After several days, and the city seemed to be consumed by the lawsuit and the verdict against Brad Conley, Mayor Langston Drew's office became the focal point of an unprecedented wave of emotions. His desk was piled high with envelopes of all colors, with stacks of handwritten letters sent from across states, from places he had never visited yet, where people felt as though they had just exhaled after years of silence. On the floor, cardboard boxes held hundreds of letters, still unopened, each one marked with hurried or careful handwriting, some even stained with ink from the writer's tears. Langston sat quietly reading each letter, his eyes moving slowly as if to engrave each word, each story, and each expression of gratitude and pain sent by strangers. Thank you for not seeking revenge, for keeping your head held high. One hastily written letter on school paper made him pause for a long time, his hand gently gripping the thin paper as though promising to continue doing what was right, even if it meant paying the price once more. Another letter came from a family who had lost a loved one in an unjust arrest years ago, the shaky words recounting the fear and helplessness when justice failed them, ending with, "These letters are the cries of so many who were never heard." Langston felt his chest heavy, not with his own sorrow, but because he realized he was holding the pain of an entire community, voices long buried under the dust of fear and prejudice. Outside in the hallway, his staff moved more quietly than usual, aware that these letters were something greater than just ordinary expressions of gratitude. There was a letter from a 12-year-old boy who wrote that now he believed he could grow up in a more just city. Another from a veteran admitting he had once turned his back on protests, thinking nothing would ever change. But after the recent trial, he wanted to apologize and promise to help protect justice. Each letter was a piece of the puzzle together, forming a true picture of a society that had endured too much injustice, and how Langston's unwavering action had rekindled the belief that the law could belong to everyone, not just a few. He set the letters he had just read aside, sighed, and looked out the window where the late afternoon light spread across the busy street below, feeling the weight of responsibility even greater than when he first took office as mayor. The letters were not to praise him, but to remind him that the journey ahead was still long, that many voices still hadn't been given justice, and he could not stop. As night fell, the office was bathed in the soft glow of yellow light. Langston sat there surrounded by piles of unopened letters, his hands slowly turning each envelope as if fearing to miss any story. He couldn't respond to all, but every line he read seemed to carve itself into his heart, reminding him that the victory achieved did not erase the losses that had occurred. It merely opened a door for those who had suffered to hold their heads high. Below the building, small groups of people still gathered discussing the future of the city. They believed something had truly changed, but Langston understood that real, lasting change would only come when those voices once silenced were heard and respected in every decision made by the government. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment, then opened them, his gaze no longer tired but more resolute than ever. In the room, filled with letters where every story was a reminder, he knew that the greatest thing he could do was not to erase the pain of the past, but to ensure that no letter in the future would ever again write about the recurring injustice under the guise of those called law enforcers. Langston sat in the office, now empty, late into the night. The yellow light spilled over stacks of letters scattered across the desk and floor, the smell of fresh paper and ink mixing in the air, as if he was surrounded by thousands of overlapping stories. He didn't rush to organize or sort, but gently picked up each letter, feeling the weight of the words filled with pain, gratitude, and the hopes of strangers sent to him. Some letters were hastily written on school paper, others carefully placed in thick envelopes, but all shared one desire: that what he had done would not end with the trial, that justice would continue to stand above prejudice. After reading through a stack of letters, Langston stood and walked to the whiteboard where he often noted the city's upcoming projects, took a pen and pinned a small piece of paper with just 4 short words that he whispered to himself: "Justice is dignity." He stared at the words for a long time, feeling them not as a mere phrase, but as a vow to protect the dignity of every citizen as the foundation of true justice, something that had been stripped away far too many times by those draped in power who had forgotten the value of humanity. His secretary, Alyssa, quietly entered with a cup of still steaming tea, her eyes red from the long days she had spent alongside him and the team. She glanced around the room, seeing the letters spread out like scars of history just uncovered, and Langston's gaze still fixed on the paper he had pinned to the board. That moment made her choke on her words, because she knew this wasn't the joy of someone who had won a lawsuit. It was the burden of someone carrying an entire city on his shoulders. Alyssa placed the tea on the desk, her voice soft, but enough to fill the silence in the room. "You didn't win this case, you saved the city." His words faltered for a moment before he nodded gently, not to accept praise, but to acknowledge the truth that what had just happened wasn't only for him or those who had spoken out, but for the thousands who had been forgotten, for the cries of injustice once silenced, and for the future generations that must be protected from the cycle of inequality. He turned back to his desk, placing his hands on the unopened envelopes, feeling as if he were holding the broken pieces of a city that had just escaped the darkness. The words written inside were the foundation for the change that he and everyone else had started together. The phrase, "Justice is dignity," on the board stood like a guiding light in the quiet room, reminding him that his responsibility now was not only to prevent wrongdoings from repeating, but also to mend the trust that had once been broken. Outside the window, the city was still lit with the familiar sounds of daily life echoing through the streets, but beneath it all were hearts beating with a new rhythm of trust, believing that the law could belong to them. Langston sighed softly, not to release his exhaustion, but to gather more resolve. He knew that every step he took from here on would be scrutinized, but he was ready, because no one else should ever be pulled into the cruel cycle he had once endured. In the room, filled with letters and heavy silence, Langston understood that from today justice was no longer just a matter of legal documents. It was the dignity that every citizen deserved to receive and protect at all costs. That morning, the elementary school playground in the quiet neighborhood buzzed with an unusual excitement, as the teachers had prepared a special talk for the students about justice and dignity. The small auditorium was simply decorated with drawings created by the children depicting loving moments in family scenes of people helping each other, and a few images of the city flag flying against a clear blue sky. Langston Drew entered the curious eyes of the children, no longer wearing his usual formal suit, but a simple shirt and a kind smile that made the atmosphere less formal. Sitting down on a wooden chair in the circle of students, Langston could feel their mixed curiosity and innocence, as though their unanswered questions about the world beyond were waiting for him to provide the answers. A curly-haired girl in the front row clasped her hands together, her bright eyes looking straight at him, then gently raised her hand and asked in a voice that was clear but filled with a concern no child should have to think about at that age, "If you weren't the mayor, would they apologize?" The question fell into the room, and the atmosphere suddenly quieted. The teacher's eyes momentarily flickered with hesitation, and a few other students looked to Langston as if seeking the truth that was too often distorted by adults. He leaned slightly forward, took the little hand in his, and responded in a warm yet firm tone, each word clear as if to engrave it into the minds of everyone listening. "True justice doesn't care about titles." He paused for a moment, looked around the room, and continued. "If a society only apologizes to those with power, that is not justice, it is just fear. True justice is when everyone, whether a child or someone with no name, is respected and protected equally." The answer left the small auditorium silent for a moment before a boy at the back timidly raised his hand, his eyes shy but filled with hope. "So, will we be able to grow up without being afraid of the police?" Langston looked at the children, his face gentle, but his eyes steady, as if promising something greater than himself. "You deserve to grow up in a city where the police protect you, not harm you. We will make that a reality together. And every question you ask today is the power that will remind adults of their responsibility." His words resonated throughout the room, causing many of the teachers sitting behind to quietly wipe away tears as they understood that these children were carrying the fear that should not exist in a truly just society. The conversation continued with simple yet sharp questions, the innocent concerns about why people were arrested because of their skin color, their gaze, their silence, or simply standing in the wrong place. Langston answered each one with sincerity and patience, not sugarcoating the truth, but also not letting the darkness overwhelm the hope of the children. He spoke of a city that was changing, where mistakes were brought to light, where thousands had stood up to say that the law must be a shield, not a weapon, and where every question from the children today was a brick in the foundation of a different future. When the conversation ended, many of the children rushed to hug him, their eyes shining with the belief that what he had promised would become a reality. Langston walked out of the schoolyard looking up at the high blue sky. Hearing the innocent laughter ringing out, his heart lightened just a little, but his resolve even stronger because he knew justice would only truly exist when no child ever had to ask those questions again. Later that afternoon, after Langston had left the school, The small art room at the end of the hallway remained lit. A group of students gathered around the drawing table with boxes of crayons and sheets of paper still marked with pencil strokes. Among them, the girl who had asked the question earlier was still sitting carefully mixing colors on her paper, her small hands focused but with a new quiet pride in her eyes. When she finished, she placed down the drawing an image of a black man standing tall against a red and blue background, symbolizing the flashing police lights surrounded by wavy, gray lines representing sirens. Yet the man's face showed no fear, his eyes looking straight ahead, breaking through the chaos. The drawing carried a silent strength, not just a child's artwork, but a message that courage could stand firm in the face of injustice. And that image was now etched in the minds of the children, a reminder that truth and dignity cannot be subdued by violence. The next day, the teacher decided to hang the drawing on the large wall of the school library next to the high bookshelves filled with books about human rights and the history of the struggle for freedom. When the picture was hung, the space seemed brighter, the crude yet heartfelt strokes of the drawing making anyone who passed by stop and take a look. Other children peered through the glass door, whispering about how their friend had turned the story of the mayor into an image full of hope that even when the police sirens blared threateningly, there could still be a resilient figure standing tall without yielding. Beneath the drawing were words written in the girl's handwriting. No one should be handcuffed just for existing. The adults in the school stood silent for a long while, for the message was both simple and heartbreaking, reflecting a reality that children should not have to know so soon. In the late afternoon, when the hallways had emptied of students, the homeroom teacher returned to the library and stood in front of the drawing once more. Her gaze softened, part pride for her students, part recognition of the change spreading from these young hearts. She whispered, as if speaking to herself, but also to the vast emptiness. The kids now believe the law has a heart too. It was not just a reflection, but a wish that what had happened in the city would no longer be mere sentences or cold numbers, but lessons that would help the law protect rather than harm. In that quiet moment, she understood that the drawing was not just colors on paper, proof that lost faith was being restored, and that hope for a more just society was beginning in the hearts of children, where justice was not a distant concept, but a truth that could be touched and felt with all one's heart. That morning, City Hall was packed from the hallways to the front steps, faces pressing forward to catch a clear view of the moment the city had awaited for many months. Camera flashes fired in rapid bursts, capturing every detail from the expression on Langston's face to the thick dossier before him and the fountain pen resting neatly on the wooden table. The air in the council chamber carried a pressure that was both heavy and electric, for everyone knew this was a turning point not only in law, but in how the city faced itself. When the clerk read aloud the title of the document, the Act to Establish the Independent Police Oversight Commission, the sound reverberated against every wall, sending a wave of murmurs like a collective exhale awaiting release. Langston sat upright, his gaze sweeping across the rows of reporters and citizens. In that moment, he was no longer the man once dragged through the street, no longer the symbol of a wrongful arrest, but the person holding in his hands a chance to lay the foundation for a new order, one in which power would no longer exist beyond the reach of community oversight. He took the pen, his hand trembling slightly with the knowledge that each stroke of ink would leave its mark on the city's history. No one spoke as the tip touched paper, the faint scratch louder than any chant ever shouted in protest. When the final signature was placed, he gently set the pen aside and looked up at the entire chamber. "I do not want another person to have to beg for the right to be respected," he said, the words carrying in full and clear, requiring no emphasis, yet strong enough for dozens of recorders to capture as if it were a declaration. In the crowd, some clenched their fists, Others raised tissues to their eyes, for the words did not just point toward the future, but seemed to bid farewell to a past filled with scars. Reporters quickly scribbled notes, their questions rising about the scope of authority, about how the new commission would operate, about commitments to end all forms of cover-up and abuse of power. Langston answered each one without avoidance, drawing on his personal experience to stress that oversight was not meant to dismantle the police, but to ensure that law enforcement always stood with the citizen. He spoke briefly of nights in a cell when he had been denied the right to make a call, of the eyes of guards who knew he was innocent but could do nothing, and of the fear that had been rooted in the community for generations. "This is not a symbolic gesture," he said, "but a structure to prevent at the root what happened to me and to thousands of others." Outside the steps of City Hall, loudspeakers broadcast his words live, and the crowd beyond listened in silence. They had marched many times, held signs high, demanded what had now become reality. An elderly woman with a cane stood at the front, looking up at the large screen showing Langston's image, nodding slightly, as if to confirm that her life had been lived to witness something worthwhile. Community groups clasped hands, not erupting in noisy cheers, but exchanging looks of trust. When the signing ceremony ended, Langston stepped down from the podium, walking past the rows of citizens and stopping to shake hands with a man who had once written to him about his younger brother's wrongful arrest. He said simply, "Now, there will be someone to hear those stories from the start." The man nodded, his expression seeming a little lighter. Stepping outside, Langston saw a brilliant blue sky, sunlight glinting off the glass windows of City Hall, a stark contrast to the days when this place had been filled only with petitions and protests. Across the street, a group of students watched, some holding up phones to record, others standing with arms crossed, their eyes fixed on him. Langston smiled, knowing it was those eyes that would be the true measure of every promise made. News of the bill's signing spread through broadcasts all day, not only locally but on national media. Editorials analyzed the meaning of granting oversight power to an independent commission, framing it as a model that could be replicated in other cities. Photographs of Langston holding the pen beside the bold printed title of the law were shared tens of thousands of times on social media, accompanied by captions expressing the belief that justice, though slow, could still arrive. And in all those images, what people remembered most was his remark, a simple but far-reaching reminder that respect is a birthright, not something to be begged for. That afternoon, Langston returned to his office, where the window looked out onto the crowds still gathered outside City Hall, taking pictures, talking, and preserving the moment. He stood watching, feeling clearly that a new wind had swept into the city, a wind of irreversible change. On his desk, the freshly signed document still carried the scent of new ink, and he knew that from now on every line of it would be a binding promise, not only for the system but for himself, to uphold his commitment to those who had placed their trust in him. In silence, he repeated the words he had spoken while signing, as if to etch them deeper in his mind, then allowed himself a faint smile. The city had turned a page, and this time that page would not be torn away. Across midday broadcasts, the headline, "The bill signed from handcuffs," appeared widely like a symbolic narrative. Every newspaper and television channel recalled in detail how Langston had signed a reform bill inside City Hall, with the image of him years earlier being dragged through the street still vivid in the public's memory. A national news anchor said that never before had the gap between a moment of humiliation and a moment of restored dignity felt so close. In cafes, conversations circled around how a man once treated as a criminal had become the one to sign away the unchecked power that had weighed on the community for far too long. The phrase "Banhand" from handcuffs quickly became a slogan on posters, printed on t-shirts, and even used as the title for panel discussions on justice and systemic reform. That day's ceremony did not end when Langston left the signing table. Applause erupted and stretched on as if those hands were pouring out years of pent-up emotion. The sound traveled from the auditorium to the steps of City Hall, then spilled into the streets, blending with cheers, whistles, and even the cries of those who felt they had just witnessed a shared shared victory. On the surrounding streets, the familiar sound of patrol cars was completely drowned out by the clapping, making the entire area feel cut off from its usual rhythm. A middle-aged man held his young son on his shoulders, clapping as he told Tatum this was the sound of a city healing itself. Many who had attended the ceremony stayed long after Langston was gone. They gathered in small groups discussing how the law would change police operations, who would serve on the new Oversight Commission, and whether this might be the first step toward restoring lost trust. Some young people live-streamed the scene to thousands of viewers, including many in other cities, hoping this model would spread. In one corner of the square, a group of students hung a large banner reading "No More Handcuffs for the Innocent" directly beneath the LED screen, replaying the moment Langston signed the bill. In the evening, news editors wove in the image of applause, drowning out sirens as a symbol of power, shifting from fear to hope. An international channel produced a full-length segment that opened with footage of Langston being escorted away and ended with him signing the bill, highlighting the almost unimaginable contrast in such a short time. Online commentators called it the moment when the people's voice overpowered authority, as if to affirm that the law at last reflected the will of those long pushed to the margin. That night, restaurants and bars across the city were swept up in the moment. Many played back the signing ceremony for customers, and each time the applause swelled, the room joined in as if they were there in person. An older couple, veterans of many marches against police violence, told a reporter they had never believed they would hear that sound, the sound of a community united without needing to raise a single sign or shout a single demand. By the next morning, the images and sounds of the day before were still everywhere. Newspapers printed the phrase the bill signed from handcuffs in bold on the front page beneath a photo of Langston raising the pen after signing. Morning commentary shows analyzed the bill's impact, predicted the police department's reaction, and most agreed that public pressure had now become an unshakable part of policy making. In neighborhoods, many families pinned clippings from the paper to their walls as a reminder that justice is not an abstract idea but can exist clearly in a single signature and a long sustained round of applause. Langston, in his office, continued to receive dozens of congratulatory calls and speaking invitations, accepting only those he believed could help push the bill's implementation further. He knew that signing it was one thing, but making it live in daily life was the real challenge. Looking out the window onto the street, he saw people still gathered and talking, while a few police cars rolled by slowly without causing any tension, an image rare in earlier days. That afternoon, a group of elementary school students visited the city hall. They were shown the signing room, told the story behind the bill, signed from handcuffs, and left holding small cards printed with Langston's words, "I don't want one more person to have to beg for the right to be respected." The applause of yesterday had faded, but its echo remained not only in the air, but in conversations, glances, and the resolve of a community that had just reclaimed its voice. The central hall, where the Police Reform Forum took place, was filled with hundreds of delegates from various states, the bright lights casting down on the long rows of seats where lawmakers, social activists, lawyers, and victims of racial violence sat together. The atmosphere was tense, yet hopeful, as everyone understood that this was the first step in a broader journey of change, where truth and personal experience would serve as the strongest weapons to force the system to reflect on itself. As the host introduced Langston Drew, he stepped up to the podium, and the murmurs in the room gradually quieted. He was dressed simply, without his mayoral badge, not flaunting his position, but carrying only the story and determination that had changed his city. He began in a deep, clear voice, each word seeming to come from his own experiences. "I once thought my position would protect me, but only only dignity can save us." His words silenced the room. Many people bowed their heads, others nodded slightly as if hearing a truth they had long avoided. That power and titles cannot stand against abuse. Only steadfastness with dignity and justice can protect people from the invisible wounds caused by injustice. Langston continued his story, recounting the moments when he was forced down onto the hot asphalt, his wrists painfully shackled, and realizing that his title of mayor couldn't save him from the deeply ingrained prejudices in some of those who wore the badge of law. He spoke about other victims, the anonymous letters sent to his office, each one a story of fear, imposed silence, and trust stolen away. "This is no longer my story," he said, his voice trembling but strong. "This is a story of all those who were made to believe they weren't worthy of protection." In the hall, many faces showed signs of emotion, and some quickly wiped away tears as they remembered incidents they had witnessed but had been unable to change. A delegate from another state stood up, his voice both serious and laden with the concerns of millions watching the session live on television. "Do you still believe in the police?" That question hung in the air, making the entire room seem to hold its breath. Langston looked around, his gaze neither angry nor avoiding, just reflecting a painful truth he had contemplated for months. He answered slowly, each word clear, "I believe in those who dare not pull the trigger unjustly." He paused for a moment, then continued, "I believe in those who wear that uniform to protect, not to instill fear, who stand up when they see their teammates wrong, who choose justice over power. I believe in the police when they remember that the badge on their chest is to serve people, not crush them." His answer prompted the first round of applause in the session, not because it was beautiful, but because it was real, because it opened the hope that even within the system there were still good people who could start again. The afternoon session continued with questions about rebuilding trust, about what needs to be done to ensure no child grows up fearing the sound of police sirens. Langston listened, offered his insights, and emphasized that the new law was just the first step. Real reform would only come when each community was empowered to oversee, when every voice of the people was valued equally to the power of law enforcement. He concluded his speech with a short but impactful statement that made the entire room rise in unison. "We will never have true peace until justice no longer chooses who deserves protection." The applause erupted, blending with cheers from outside the building, where hundreds of citizens were watching on large screens, sending a message that change was no longer a dream, but a shared goal of an entire nation determined to rewrite the laws of justice with human dignity at its core. As Langston's final words echoed and faded into the stillness of the hall, no one asked another question or made a comment. A moment of silence, like a collective breath, stretched for a few seconds. Then, one by one, from the front rows to the back, everyone stood up. No words were spoken, no chants were heard, only the sound of clapping steady and relentless, but never disrupting the sanctity of that moment. This wasn't applause for a speech or a politician, but a heartfelt thank you from people who understood they had just witnessed a truth spoken aloud that few had dared to voice before. The sound spread like a heartbeat shared by hundreds of people in that large room, the heartbeat of a nation longing for justice, rooted in humanity, where the law protects dignity, not harms it. Langston stood still, his eyes misty but his gaze resolute, his hands gently clenched as if to hold on to that emotion and turn it into strength for the steps ahead. He understood this was no longer his story alone, but something that everyone in that room now shared. Outside the walls of the conference, across social media platforms, another wave erupted with force. The image of Langston, standing at the podium with hundreds of people rising and clapping in silence behind him, was captured and spread at lightning speed. Beneath each photo, each short clip, the words, #justice, his dignity appeared in unison. The phrase he had written on the whiteboard in his office had now become the message of a nation reclaiming its faith in the law and justice. Millions shared that hashtag, from families who had lost loved ones to police violence to human rights lawyers to ordinary citizens who had once felt their voices didn't matter, all writing that justice cannot exist without the dignity of every human being. The map of social media lit up with dots spreading across the states, reflecting the reality that Langston's story had gone beyond the boundaries of a city and had become a collective voice for the entire country. On national television, news channels repeatedly aired the moment the hall stood up, commenting that it was one of the rare images that could slow down the noise of the modern age, forcing people to stop and think about what truly matters in this justice system. Editorials emphasized that the reform movement now had a heart, that it was no longer about numbers or dry laws, but the story of people who had suffered but still stood up, turning that pain into action and hope. As Langston left the hall, the sound of applause still resonated, as if it had never ceased blending with the clicks of keyboards outside as millions continued to share the story with that hashtag. Tonight, the city was lit up not only by streetlights but also by screens spreading the same message of promise, that justice would never again be measured by skin color or status, but by the dignity of every person living in this society. On the street, once known by locals as the walkway of silence because people would bow their heads to avoid eye contact whenever passing the police station, the atmosphere was unusually lively. A crew of workers was carefully taking down the old sign that had hung there for decades, each letter tied to an era when residents, especially people of color, carried deep suspicion and fear. As soon as the sign was lowered, a gleaming new plaque was lifted into place, its bold inscription reading, "Serve all, not by skin color." The moment was captured from multiple angles by local newspaper and television reporters, their cameras framing not only the act of replacing the sign, but also the faces of those watching, some moved, some curious. The video spread rapidly afterward, not just as a news clip of a simple event, but as tangible proof that change had stepped out of the council chamber slogans and onto the street. Residents gathered in small groups across the road, some elderly, murmuring that they never thought they'd see such a sight in their lifetime. Some young people live streaming it so friends online could witness it, and some breaking into tears when the new words appeared. Several journalists quickly moved in to interview officers present. Among the blue uniforms, a young officer leaned against a patrol car, eyes meeting the camera without flinching. When asked about the meaning of the new sign, he replied briefly but firmly, "I joined to protect, not to judge." The remark, broadcast through a filming crew's loudspeaker, quickly became the headline of several afternoon stories. Readers sensed not just a personal defense, but a declaration from a new generation of officers seeking to distance themselves from the shadows left by the past. The new words on the sign caught the sunlight standing out against the glass windows of the building. It was more than a nameplate. It was a declaration meant to make those working inside reflect on themselves every day. Older officers, with decades of service behind them, looked up at the new sign in silence. They said nothing, but a few nodded slightly, as if accepting that the era of looking the other way had passed. Community activists were also present, taking photos, noting details, and sending messages to forums saying this was not the final victory, but a first step that needed to be sustained. Online, the video of the sign change circulated alongside a range of comments. Some were joyful, seeing it as a positive signal for reform. Others were cautious, warning that true change required more than a new plaque. Yet, all agreed that the moment carried strong symbolic weight, especially since it happened at a site repeatedly accused of discrimination and abuse of power. Teachers shared the video in classrooms, using it as an example to show students the impact of symbols in society, how even a small act could carry deep meaning when paired with genuine commitment. Meanwhile, The young officer continued his patrol work as usual, but now many residents greeted him on the street, some even returning his smile, something they had rarely done before. This change could not be measured by statistics right away, but it created a new atmosphere, a space where trust had a chance to take root. The police station, once a cold block of concrete in the community's eyes, had become at least a place people no longer avoided. Conversations on sidewalks and in nearby cafes began to mention trying to trust for once something hardly anyone had dared to say before. And somewhere, as Langston watched the evening news and saw the image of the new sign on the screen, he simply smiled. He understood that every reform began with signs that seemed small, but opened the way for deeper changes. The new sign could not immediately erase prejudice or wrongdoing, but it was a public reminder that the old era had passed and that everyone was watching to make sure this promise would not be betrayed. Langston sat in his office as the morning news played from the old radio on his desk, the announcer's voice reporting that a police station in another state had just replaced its sign with the words, "Serve all, not by skin color." He looked up, gazing out the window, where autumn light filtered through the glass and fell across the unfinished stack of documents. His eyes slowly rested on a small framed photo hanging in the corner, an image of himself standing before the new sign in this city just weeks earlier. The corner of his mouth lifted in a quiet but meaningful smile, and he murmured as if speaking only to himself, "The seed has finally sprouted." It was not a boast of victory, but an affirmation that long efforts, fierce confrontations, and sleepless nights had not been in vain. In recent months, he had received news from other states, places that had once been silent or stood by now beginning to take action. First came a few discussions in city councils, then proposals to amend regulations, and finally images of the first sign replacements appearing online. Each new sign raised was another piece in the puzzle of nationwide change. Photos, videos, and articles about these ceremonies flooded community forums inspiring neighboring areas. Residents shared, commented, and, more importantly, began asking their local officials, when will it change here? From a southern state came the image of a group of high school students standing before a newly resigned police station holding banners reading "Justice for All," moving tens of thousands. In the West, a young mayor held a simple but emotional ceremony inviting families who had once been victims of police violence to cut the ribbon. In the North, a small community decided to hang its new sign without waiting for orders from above, believing that justice could not wait for procedure. This wave of change needed no grand publicity campaign, traveling instead through the path of real stories, real faces, and visible transformations. Langston followed everything from a distance, noting the timelines like a gardener watching each new sprout emerge after the rain. He understood that once a seed had sprouted, it needed constant care to keep it from dying under pests or drought. Each new sign raised was not only a joy, but also a responsibility, to keep the words on it from fading in meaning over time. In conversations with colleagues and activists, he emphasized that changing a sign was only the first step, and that the greater task was maintaining a culture of fairness within the force and ensuring regular oversight. National media began to take notice of the phenomenon, calling it the new sign wave, a small but powerful movement that began with a shocking incident and spread like a domino effect. Reporters sought out Langston to ask what he thought of his original idea crossing city lines. He simply replied, "Each sign is a promise, and that promise must be kept through action." The statement was widely quoted, became the headline for many articles, and appeared in countless social media posts with the hashtag Seed of Justice. Residents in places where signs had been replaced said that since the new words went up, it had become easier to walk into a police station to report an incident or seek help. A woman in a Midwestern state said that for the first time in years, she no longer felt scrutinized the moment she walked through the door. A group of young black men shared that they could clearly sense a more open attitude from officers, even if moments of suspicion still surfaced, but at least the change had begun. In some places, replacing the sign was accompanied by retraining programs for police, bringing in experts in social justice and human rights to teach. There were community officer dialogues where both sides sat at the same table, sharing personal stories to better understand one another. These images, once shared in the media, only strengthened the message that change was possible, as long as there was determination and community oversight. Langston realized the most valuable thing the movement had brought was not the number of new signs, but the way it stirred a sense of ownership over justice in the public. In the past, many believed that law and policing were top-down forces that could not be changed. Now, they saw they could make the system listen and adapt. It was a subtle but profound shift in power, from fear to rightful demand. That afternoon, walking through the central square, Langston came across a group of students taking photos in front of a wall covered with images of new signs sent from across the country. They laughed and talked about hosting a small exhibition, inviting the community to see and hear the stories behind each picture. He paused for a moment, not wanting to interrupt, but quietly committing the scene to memory. He knew that once seeds had rooted in the hearts of the young, they would continue to bear fruit with or without his presence in the future. That morning in the central square, where thousands had once gathered during the most tense days of the fight for justice, the space was now bathed in soft, golden sunlight with birds chirping overhead. The temporary barricades once set up to protect the protesters were gone, replaced by freshly planted flower beds lining the paths, symbolizing the city's healing of its own memories. On the lamp posts and walls where posters with the words "Justice is Dignity" had once been plastered, groups of young people and older citizens were quietly removing the last of the remaining signs. They worked in silence, not out of frustration or forgetting the message, but because today they knew they no longer needed to raise banners to demand to be heard. This simple act felt like a ritual to close a chapter of protest with chants and signs, making way for a new era where the law had officially affirmed what they had once taken to the streets to remind everyone of. The people gathered in small groups chatting as they took down the weathered posters that had faded from exposure to the sun and rain. With trembling hands but filled with hope, they carefully peeled off old tape and rolled up the signs as keepsakes of a difficult journey. Among the crowd, an elderly man with graying hair who had been at every protest since the beginning slowly removed the sign he had carried for months. The words "Justice is Dignity" had faded but were still visible. He looked at it for a long while, his eyes shining with relief, then turned to the crowd around him, his voice hoarse but loud as he declared, "No need to raise banners anymore. Today the law has spoken." His words silenced those around him, with some smiling, others with tears in their eyes as they understood that this journey had finally borne real results. It was not the victory of an individual, but the victory of voices once forgotten, now enshrined in law, standing strong and undistorted like the posters on the wall. The square felt different now, no longer echoing with angry chants or the shrill sirens of police cars. Instead, it was filled with the soft laughter of children running around the fountain and calm conversations about the future instead of fear. Journalists captured this moment, no longer snapping photos of tense protests, but of citizens gently taking down their own banners with peace. Social media was flooded with images of the square after the long day of struggle, with the most common caption being, "Justice has become law. No more shouting to be heard." Langston stood at the edge of the square, not speaking, not needing to be the central figure, but silently observing the scene with tears in his eyes. He understood that these banners had never been meaningless. They had been the only weapon for the powerless to fight injustice, and taking them down today was not the end of that memory, but a milestone, proving that the people's voices had been answered by the law, protecting everyone without the need for a new march. In the gentle breeze, the cloth banners were rolled up and stored sword preserved as relics of a historic moment so that one day when the story is told, people will know that justice in this city was reclaimed, not by power but by the unwavering resolve and trust of the people who stood in this square. That afternoon, the golden sunlight bathed the square, which had just been cleared of posters and banners, but the air was still filled with warmth and relief. Groups of young people, once familiar faces in the protests, gathered by the fountain, embracing each other in loud laughter, no longer tense or anxious, as they had been during the days when they took to the streets ready to run when the sirens blared. Some lay on the green grass, eyes closed, as they savored the peace they were experiencing for the first time after so many days of uncertainty. In the deep blue sky, there were no longer surveillance helicopters circling above. The heavy sound of blades, which once carried the weight of being watched and threatened, was now replaced by a gentle breeze with birds calling to each other on the rooftops of high-rise buildings. This newfound silence made many young people look at each other, and without words, they understood that this moment was proof of what they had fought for together, that fear no longer held power here. They captured this moment with photos, not to accompany calls or warnings, but simply to preserve the feeling of true freedom that had returned to this land for the first time. The city seemed to breathe in unison, every corner filled with life that had long been hidden beneath the shroud of tension and suspicion. The cafes along the streets were livelier, soft music playing from open windows, welcoming the breeze, and children running freely across the square, no longer pulled hurriedly by their parents. Along the avenue, shops displayed signs welcoming a new day without riot police surrounding them. No loudspeakers calling for crowds to disperse, just smiles exchanged between the people and young officers patrolling in silence with friendly gazes replacing suspicion. An elderly man sat on a bench, eyes half closed, taking a deep breath of the fresh air that had been returned to the city. His face relaxed as though the weight of many years had been lifted off him. That feeling spread throughout the city like it had been shackled for too long and was finally freed, no longer living under constant surveillance where every step felt watched and every word could trigger the sound of a siren. As evening fell, the sunset painted the rooftops and high-rise windows red. The breeze carried the familiar scent of the city streets through the avenues, and the people blended into the normal rhythm of life they had longed to reclaim. In the square, many people formed a circle, holding hands as if to feel that this change was real, that they were no longer alone in the journey for justice and peace. Langston stood at a distance, watching, his eyes gleaming with pride and emotion as he witnessed the scene. There were no speeches, no slogans. This peacefulness was the greatest reward for all the months of struggle. The city took its deepest breath in years, the air filling every lung, cleansing the old wounds, reminding them that freedom doesn't come from signed documents, but from moments when people can laugh, embrace, and live without looking up at the sky in fear of a surveillance helicopter. And today, that city finally had that. On the final afternoon of a long day, the city park was bathed in the soft golden hues of sunset, with the last rays of sunlight falling across the white lines of the walkway around the still lake. The breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass, the rustling of leaves, and in the distance the sound of children laughing and playing on the playground. Langston Drew sat alone on his usual stone bench, a baseball cap pulled low over his tired face, but his eyes still bright as if embracing the entire city after all the turmoil that had passed. In his hands he held a thick notebook filled with ideas for future reforms, but for now he let it close, savoring the quiet moment that he and the city had fought so long to achieve. As he silently watched the birds swoop down to the water's edge, a 10-year-old boy passed by, the sound of his sneakers tapping on the white lines before he stopped in front of the bench, his eyes filled with curiosity and respect. "You're the one who was wrongly arrested, right?" the boy asked, his voice clear without hesitation, as if the question had been held in his heart for a long time. Langston turned to him, his lips curling into a soft, kind smile, though his eyes still carried a trace of sadness, and he nodded slowly. "Yes, and I won't let that happen again." The boy stared at him for a few seconds, seemingly trying to fully grasp the meaning that a person could turn pain into a promise to prevent others from suffering the same. The boy sat down beside him, his feet swinging over the empty space beneath the bench, his eyes still fixed on the lake where the fading light turned the surface into streaks of orange and red. After a few moments of silence, the boy lowered his voice as if afraid to break the peace around them. "Were you scared?" Langston looked down at his hands, still slightly calloused from signing countless documents and handling letters from across the country. He took a deep breath, then turned to the boy with a gaze both firm and sincere, his voice low but clear. "I was scared like anyone would be when they see what's right being trampled on, scared when you know you could lose everything just for speaking up. But justice needs people who won't bow down. If everyone stays silent, injustice will keep walking all over these white lines and no one will stop it." The boy grew quiet, his eyes lighting up with a new understanding, as if for the first time he realized that justice wasn't just a distant concept in books. It required real people with blood and courage to stand up for it and protect it for everyone. In that moment, the evening breeze gently blew, carrying distant laughter and the sound of cars driving slowly down the street, but the space around the two of them seemed to freeze. The boy gripped the strap of his backpack, nodded firmly as if making a promise to himself, then stood and waved goodbye to Langston before continuing down the white lines toward home. Langston watched the small figure walk away, a feeling of both bittersweetness and warmth rising in his chest. He understood that this journey had never been solely his, and that every child's question, every innocent nod today would be the seed planted for the future where justice wouldn't have to be fought for, but would naturally exist in the rhythm of the city. As the sunset faded, Langston stood up, walking slowly along the path, feeling each white line beneath his feet as a reminder that even the smallest righteous actions leave a mark, and he vowed to continue down this path until the day those little footsteps could grow up without ever having to ask whether justice needs courage to protect it. As the sunset slipped into the night, the streetlights flickered on, casting a soft golden hue over the park, like the deep sigh of a city that had long been suppressed. Langston sat on the old stone bench, his eyes following the boy as he walked slowly along the white lines leading to the main road. Neither spoke again, but the silence wasn't heavy. It carried a rare sense of peace, where the past shouting had been replaced by a quiet with deep meaning. In the distance, the intersection leading into the city center changed the colors of its traffic lights, the green, yellow, and red lights blinking steadily. But unlike before, there were no sharp sirens cutting through the space. The street in front was calm, with cars passing slowly as if afraid to disrupt this moment. And Langston felt that this peace wasn't a gift handed down by anyone, but the result of a long journey to reclaim dignity and the right to live without fear for every citizen. He glanced at the boy, who turned back and smiled at him, and in the child's youthful gaze there was trust that justice was no longer distant, that the city's streets had shifted their rhythm, no longer dictated by the blaring sirens of wrongful pursuits, but had returned to be spaces where people could walk without anxiety. Together, they watched the traffic lights change once more quietly, marking the moment when true freedom became a clear part of their everyday lives. Langston stood up, took a few slow steps, then turned back to look at the bench he had just sat on, where many deep conversations with the people had taken place after the historic trial. On the edge of the bench, a hand-carved inscription, likely made by someone who had sat there before him, caught his eye. "Justice is when an ordinary person is still respected." He bent down his hand, gently brushing over the simple yet powerful lettering, feeling as though he had just touched the heartfelt wish of countless souls who had longed for this but did not live to see it come true. The words were simple, but contained everything he had worked toward, everything the people of this city had marched for, everything the anonymous letters sent to his office had conveyed in place of their tears. He smiled, not a smile of victory, but one of deep understanding and empathy for the thousands of stories that contributed to this day. Ahead of him, the traffic lights changed once again. The streets remained calm and breezy, a reminder that justice doesn't reside in speeches or loud court hearings, but in everyday moments when an ordinary person walks past a police officer without fear, when a child grows up without being burdened by prejudice, and when respect is no longer a privilege to be begged for. Langston exhaled with relief, feeling that one journey had ended, but another path was opening, a path where he and those who follow him will continue to uphold the carved words, ensuring they never fade from the bench, from the city's memory, and from the hearts of those who believe in a justice that respects every individual. As the sunset descended over the park where Langston stood silently by the bench with the inscription, "Justice is when an ordinary person is still respected," he felt the sounds of the city merge into a collective breath, one of relief and pride. The path he and thousands of others had walked didn't begin with grand law signings or conferences, but with the moment a person was forced down onto hot asphalt, blood streaming down their face and cold cuffs tightly shackling their hands just because of their skin color. That journey passed through long nights of silence and detention, through the storm of anger from the community, as the truth spread through days of confronting a system that once claimed the power to stand above the law. It wasn't just the story of a mayor wrongfully arrested, but the story of the nameless people who had suffered the same but went unseen, the story of the cries for help erased from the records, and the story of young eyes that had learned to fear the sirens of patrol cars. Langston did not fight alone. Around him were people who dared to speak out despite being threatened, journalists digging into the truth, lawyers reopening buried cases, and thousands of citizens who refused to remain silent any longer. Every letter sent to his office carried the hope that one day the law would be a shield for all. Every step taken on the square, every shout, and even the painful moments of families who had lost loved ones all converged into the strength that forced the system to change. From the heated hearings to the historic court ruling, from the independent police oversight law to the new signs hung across states, everything stemmed from one person who refused to bow down and a community that persisted in demanding the truth. When the city finally took a deep breath without the haunting presence of surveillance helicopters, when children could run across the white lines without fearing judgmental stares, when the police department's signs were replaced with commitments to serve everyone justice, stopped being an abstract concept and became the rhythm of everyday life. Langston understood that he could not erase the pain of the past, but he and the people had paved the way for those mistakes not to repeat, for justice to no longer need to be begged for, and for a person's dignity to never again be stripped away by prejudice. His story was no longer a personal one, but a testament that the courage of an individual, when combined with collective belief, can shake an entire system that once seemed immutable. The deepest lesson from this journey was not in the verdicts or the laws signed, but in the understanding that anyone can become the first spark to drive away the shadow of injustice. Justice cannot exist without someone to protect. It cannot be maintained if we accept silence, and it becomes reality when the truth is spoken, even at a price. Langston proved that change begins when one person dares to stand up, and it is only complete when society as a whole ensures that the flame does not go out. The image of him sitting on the bench talking to a young boy he did not know. The message that justice needs those who do not bow their heads. And the changing traffic lights in a street now silent of sirens marked the final milestone of a long journey, leaving behind the belief that the future can be different, that respect is every person's birthright, and that we all have a responsibility to preserve it, not just for ourselves, but for all those who will walk the white lines tomorrow.